Hello, welcome to this session on financial abuse. I'm Emma. I'm the Domestic and Family Violence Solicitor at the Mid North Coast Community Legal Centre. I've worked as a lawyer for domestic violence victims for over 10 years in the legal assistance sector, including roles at Legal Aid and Women's Legal Service, where I ran a project that was specifically aimed at identifying and addressing issues relating to economic or financial abuse. So through this project, I came to understand the long-lasting and damaging impacts that economic abuse can cause for survivors of domestic violence and some of the structural barriers that stand in their way for recovery. I later gave evidence at the hearings of the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence, specifically about economic abuse and the ways that financial abuse can really touch every aspect of a victim's life. So today I'm going to speak to you briefly about what financial abuse is, how to spot it, the kinds of legal and financial issues it might cause for those you are assisting, and who can help your clients who are experiencing financial abuse. So this information in the presentation is not and should not be taken as legal advice. Experience of domestic violence are all different, can be rapidly changing, and the way the law applies to one client's experience might be very different in the circumstances of another. So please do feel free to contact us if you or your client feels you need legal advice. The Mid North Coast Legal Centre is a free legal service. We're confidential, we're accessible, and so our contact details are there. You can contact us via our website and online referral form for clients or via our email. Okay, so what is financial abuse? Financial abuse, also called economic abuse, or previously sometimes referred to as sexually transmitted debt. It's been recognised as having devastating consequences for some time now, but in the last sort of 5 or so years, economic abuse has been subject to more research and is becoming better understood. And so it presents in two main ways, but there are other ways that financial abuse might present. So separation is one of them. So while separation generally leaves everyone worse off financially, research has shown that women suffer particularly acute financial hardship following separation, and women with children in their care often do not recover their position financially. And this is compounded significantly for victims of domestic violence, particularly where there's financial abuse present. And in addition to intimate partner relationships, elder abuse is one of the more common forms of financial abuse. So financial abuse of an older person by a family member is a form of family violence, often called elder abuse. It's commonly perpetrated by the older person's adult child or children and can occur with or without other forms of abuse. So financial abuse can happen to anyone, regardless of gender, age, level of income, cultural background. But like other forms of family violence, financial abuse, including when it occurs as part of elder abuse, is gendered. And the majority of victim survivors are women. Of course, there's examples of financially abusive behaviour perpetrated by women or in the context of same-sex relationships. But in Australia, overwhelmingly, the research demonstrates a gender dynamic to financially abusive relationships. So financial abuse is a form of family or domestic violence. Like other forms of family or domestic violence, financial abuse is behaviour that is intended to or has the effect of controlling or dominating the life of the victim survivor. So financial abuse often forms part of a larger picture of controlling or abusive behaviour, and as we said, can happen together with other forms of domestic violence. It might worsen at separation or occur for the first time at separation. So something that I see a lot as a family lawyer assisting victims of domestic violence is where other forms of family violence might be stopped by, say, an ABO or a physical separation. So physical forms of violence, or stalking, that's when more sort of subtle, coercive, controlling types of family violence might increase. So sort of emotional abuse, and financial abuse, those kind of types of coercion. So often there's a bit of discussion around, well, what's the difference between someone having consensual control over financial decisions and someone who's engaged in financially abusive behaviour? And it really does come down to that dynamic of that larger pattern of control or abusive behaviour. So questions to ask might be, Could the victim change this financial arrangement if they wanted to? What would happen if they asked to make changes, to get access to more of their money, or joint money, to stop depositing money in a certain way, refuse to co-sign that loan agreement? Questions like that. What would be the consequence of that? In several other Australian states and territories, the AVO legislation in those states actually does have a definition of economic abuse. So not making it a crime in itself, but a ground for obtaining an AVO. And so where this definition is included in the legislation, the definition usually focuses on coercion, unreasonable control, so those kind of concepts. So in Victoria, for example, the definition of financial abuse is behaviour that is coercive, deceptive, or unreasonably controls the other person without their consent in a way that denies the second person the economic or financial autonomy they would have had but for that behaviour, or by withholding or threatening to withhold financial support necessary for meeting the reasonable living expenses of the second person, so what they need to survive. And so we unfortunately do not have such a definition in our AVO legislation in New South Wales, but the Family Law Act, which is a federal piece of legislation and applies here, does provide a definition of family violence, which has specific reference to financially abusive behaviour. And so again, included in that is unreasonably denying financial autonomy and unreasonably withholding financial support. So looking at those kind of two elements of financial abuse. Okay, so how do we spot it? Well, there's no sort of set list of behaviours that definitively are or are not financial abuse. And so it's really important to keep in mind that golden thread or coercive control that we talked about in the previous slide. So that's really present in the legislative definitions where it exists, and it's an important concept. But there are some examples of behaviours that we see pretty commonly that might alert you to the fact that potentially financial abuse is present. And so they might be things like controlling the person's access to money, making them feel scared to ask about finances, demanding to know PIN numbers, forcing to borrow money, and those kinds of things. So what problems can financial abuse create? Well, firstly, it can create greater safety issues. So financial abuse can potentially leave a victim without money for food, for basic necessities. It can result in homelessness. It can have devastating effects for victims psychologically, and can be formed as used as a form of blackmail or leverage, which might prevent someone from leaving a violent relationship and make them more vulnerable to other forms of family violence, including physical violence. It also has really serious financial and legal consequences, so leaving someone legally responsible for a large debt that they've been forced to accrue, or a range of kind of other potential legal and financial problems. And then, of course, economic literacy and confidence. So we won't have time to go into this in detail today, but certainly in my experience, I've worked with women who have managed their household finances really competently, maybe have even earned a kind of a high income, but then as a result of these financially abusive behaviours, they have really eroded their confidence, their economic literacy and confidence. So told they're bad with money, that their finances are too complicated, they won't possibly understand. And so that's kind of really limited their ability to manage their affairs. Going forward, and it's work they need to do then with a counsellor or specialist CV worker or financial counsellor or all of those professionals in order to kind of regain that economic confidence. Okay. So now I just want to focus on what we can do about some of the negative impacts of financial abuse. So here we've looked particularly at some of the financial and legal impacts of financial abuse and how to address them. Like I say, working with a financial counsellor and DV worker to address some of those psychological and emotional impacts is also extremely important. So I've outlined 7 steps here that we'll go through. They're sort of roughly in chronological order in terms of first priority order. matters, but sometimes a lot of these things need to happen all at the same time. So firstly, we're looking at safety. So that would include securing online and financial security, preventing ongoing access to accounts. So the eSafety Commissioner has a really fantastic online safety planning resource that you can access, and I've got links to that on the next slide. And so it's just there's a checklist there in terms of a range of things that clients might need to look at in terms of, obviously there's safety planning for their physical safety, but then this is safety planning in relation to their online safety and also their financial safety. So setting up a new bank account, making sure they've got a secure email, checking there's no spyware on their devices, changing their passwords when necessary, contacting the bank to make sure that they're changing accounts from 1 to sign to 2 to sign so that the accounts can't be drained. That's really important from a family law perspective. Contacting utility companies. So if you're leaving the home, making sure that you're making that contact to utility companies to ensure that you're changing your address, and so you're not missing bills, and kind of there's not arrears accumulating without you realising. So there's kind of just that range of things that you want to do from a securing your online and financial security perspective. And then moving on to the next one, so meeting basic needs. So as we've said, financial abuse can leave people really destitute and vulnerable in terms of meeting their basic needs. So there's a range of possible services in terms of emergency payments and material aid that might be able to assist. So things we would assist a client with is accessing an immediate needs support package through victim services. So you can contact us for more detail about that. I've got some links in relation to accessing that on the next page. There's also the new EBP payment available, Centrelink emergency and crisis payments, potentially contacting lenders and credit providers in relation to hardship arrangements, and also accessing family violence policies. So really kind of just dealing with those basic needs, accessing those emergency payments that is designed to help victims of family violence. And then we've got housing. So figuring out who stays in the home and how to afford that is often kind of a key concern for clients who are experiencing family violence and in particular financial abuse. So if the client is renting and the other party has left, they may need to have some conversations around ensuring that that person is removed from the lease. So whether it's an AVO, that might be more simple, or they may need to get some legal advice about that. Where they need to leave the home, they'll be wanting to, and it's a rental property, making sure they're lodging that DV termination notice as soon as possible, so they're not accruing any liability for any damage to the property or rent after they leave. Where the home is owned, and they need to determine who stays in the interim and what happens in a final property settlement. That's something they should get legal advice as soon as possible about. So there's a range of options in terms of who stays. Obviously, an AVO might be appropriate. They can also get some legal advice about injunctions. So there's kind of a range of different legal options for them in terms of housing. And then in terms of affordability over the sort of short and medium term, of course, contacting the lender, letting them know what's happening, if possible, letting them know about the family violence, and ensuring that they're accessing any family violence policies and their details are going to be kept confidential, and also accessing any kind of appropriate hardship arrangements in the interim. And so then understanding financial situation and budgeting. So this is really important from a family law context. So something we're often talking to clients about when they're considering separating or they're newly separated is just gathering all that information, ideally before you leave the home, but obviously talking to domestic violence specialists about safety around that. So that's things like copies of loans agreement, copy of bank statements, copies of superannuation statements if possible, copies of insurance, so anything to do with your kind of financial and legal affairs. If you can get copies of those things and take them with you, it's going to make ascertaining what your financial position is, both in terms of sitting down with a financial counsellor and working out your budget and who you need to talk to and what's affordable and what's not, and also sitting down with a family lawyer to figure out what's the property pool, what is there to be divided. Both of those things, it's really important to kind of have as much documentation as possible. But where there's gaps in the knowledge, that's where a financial counsellor and a lawyer can be really helpful too, in terms of requesting directly from the institution. And there's other ways that we can get that information. But if the client's able to get copies of them before they leave, that's much easier often. Okay, and then minimising debts. So we won't go into too much detail here because I understand that we're also going to, at the forum, hear from a financial counsellor. But this is where we potentially want to have conversations with lenders in relation to hardship, but it's also potentially where we want to get some legal advice around whether someone is legally responsible for a debt. So where a debt has been accrued in your client's name in circumstances of financial abuse, it may be that they actually should not be held legally responsible for the debt. And so this will vary a lot depending on the actual circumstances in which the debt was accrued. But if there is a question around, well, did they actually sign it, or was it a forged signature? Did they enter under duress? Did they derive any benefit from the loan? Where there's kind of a question about whether it was actually reasonable for the lender to ever lend them the money in the first place, where there's those kind of questions about whether the debt was properly entered into in the first place. Really important to get some consumer and credit law advice at an early stage, because sometimes communicating with the lender, so sending an email or responding to the lender in relation to a debt can be a sort of a sign of acknowledgement of the debt, and can have impacts on the legal matter. So really important to get some early consumer and credit law advice about that if possible. So yeah, as I've said, consumer and credit law options, working through hardship policies, making sure you're notifying everyone. So that includes superannuation, so changing binding beneficiaries, changing insurances, eventually wanting to talk to clients about making sure they're changing their wills. So all those kind of notifications in relation to all their legal and financial affairs, working through those. Those immediate ones are kind of notifying utility companies, any sort of debt, making sure that you're getting those debt notices. And then finally, we'll be talking to the client about family law options. So where they've experienced financial abuse, we're obviously talking to them about property settlement options. So what property is there to divide, and what's their likely entitlement to, what percentage of the property pool. And that is true even if there is only superannuation. So no other assets, just superannuation. It may be that they're entitled to some of that superannuation. So really good idea to get some legal advice. And then we're also often talking to clients about some of the interim family law orders that might be able to assist them. So are they eligible for spousal maintenance? And so that's, the legal test there is their need and the other party's ability to pay. And so getting some legal advice about whether they're eligible there, and other interim orders that might be appropriate. So we talked before about who stays in the home, who pays for the mortgage while you're sorting out the final property settlement. So getting some advice in relation to that. And also, of course, child support, Centrelink, making sure that they've got supports in relation to those. So here I've just got a list of resources and links that might be able to assist clients. So as I said, eSafety Commissioner, really great online safety planning toolkit. Victim services and EVP can be really helpful, just in meeting those immediate sort of security and relocation expenses. There's a variety of sort of online banking checklists for those experiencing financial abuse. There's a separating with debt, so a complete guide that's put out by the Attorney General's Department in relation to different options with dealing with debt after separation, Centrelink payments, child support service, and tenancy advice and advocacy service in relation to questions around rentals. Okay, so that's it from me today. So really, I guess the takeaway points from today are financial abuse is a form of family or domestic violence, and it's behaviour that has intended or has the effect of controlling or dominating the life of the victim. It has devastating legal and financial consequences that can often really be quite long lasting. And so it's important to act on financial abuse early to stop problems getting worse. So seeking that kind of financial counselling and legal help as soon as possible. And as I say, we're available to help. That's our website there. So please do contact us if you're seeing any of these issues pop up for your clients. Thank you.